Hello and welcome to Green TV, another edition of Meet the Solutionaries. As you know, this is television that covers the green beat from every possible angle. Today, we're going to be talking about green, actually the kind, money kind. And that is something that I'm really looking forward to because it's not an area with the many years that I've been covering environmental news and climate news that I've done a lot of interviews on. And I'm not quite sure why, but certainly it's very relevant right now with all the talk about the SEC proposal to get companies to have to report their carbon emissions, I believe it is. We're going to find out all about that and more with my guest. Very pleased to introduce Wright Gladstein. Welcome to the Green TV program.
Thanks so much for having me.
It was wonderful meeting you at South by Southwest in Austin a couple of weeks ago. I went right up to your booth when I saw that you were offering a way to get the companies that are part of one's 401k investment plan to be more transparent, I guess, about their carbon emissions, their carbon impact footprint, or at least you have a way so that investors can learn more about these companies. And I said, that is so needed right now. I learned so much from you and your website and Sphere, the company that you founded, that I now feel like I need to go back and ask some more questions. So welcome to the program. Really excited to have you. There's so much to talk about. Sphere is a company, you actually call it a movement to get the fossil fuels out of our 401ks. And even if we don't work for a company, which I don't, and have a 401k per se, there's still a lot of areas of investment that you are trying to make more transparent. Let's go back to why you started Sphere, because it looks like you had kind of a background in tech before that. So you clearly saw a need. What was it?
Yeah, so I've been passionate about preventing climate change really my whole life. And I started my first company, a company called IR Labs, spinning a technology out of MIT that makes data centers and supercomputers more energy efficient by using light to move data between chips. And it was just a no-brainer to me to offer climate-friendly investment options to our employees when we set up our 401k plan. So I asked our providers for some green options in our 401k lineup when I set that up. And I thought it was a simple request, but it ended up taking 3 years to get a single climate-friendly investment option in our 401k plan. So I was shocked by how long it took and how hard it was. And I ended up just spending a lot of time trying to figure out why that was and talking to a lot of people in the 401k industry. And I learned that there are some structural reasons that it's hard to avoid fossil fuel companies or just do climate friendly investing in 401ks. But none of those reasons are insurmountable. It just seemed like no one had tried to make it easy before. And I realized I could do that. And I probably should do that because money really talks. And as long as we're investing in fossil fuel companies, we're pretty much just telling them with our money, good job, keep doing what you're doing.
And it says on your website, money talks, make it shout for the planet. I like that. Money makes the world go round. And it's not an area where I think a lot of climate activists, environmental advocates tend to, I'm making a general stereotype here, but maybe we don't tend to have the biggest portfolios, or we're not doing this for the greed, scientists, researchers, activists, ridiculous, right?
It is absurd, I think, that so many investment advisors still think that you have to earn less if you're making a decision to invest with your values. There have been so many studies showing that that is just not true. There's even one study that goes back over 40 years and shows that removing fossil fuel companies from investments has either had no impact or improved returns over the past 40 years when looking at the economy at large. Our first product is tracking the top 500 US companies. So it's similar to the S&P 500 index, which is a very popular index for a lot of people. And we ran a back test. So basically we looked at the last 10 years and we said, if we applied the same rules to that 10-year period that we're applying moving forward, so we take the top 500 companies and exclude fossil fuel companies from that list, of which there are about 40, how would that portfolio have performed over the past 10 years? And we found that this portfolio performs in line with the studies and what they predicted, which is returns would have been improved over that time period compared to if one had invested in the fossil fuel companies in that top 500 group. So there are numerous studies as well as our own back test that show that you don't have to compromise One area where traditionally one does have to compromise when investing in a climate-friendly way is in fees. So there are climate-friendly products out there, but they're expensive. And that's a problem because fees, the power of compounding interest, which is what you're harnessing when you invest, it's great when you're earning interest, but that compounding happens in the negative sense on fees as well. So the higher fees you're paying, the more that adds up over time. And so an important thing in offering this product was to not price it at a premium, to have it priced in line with other S&P 500 index type products. So you don't have to compromise in terms of returns or in terms of fees. And that's pretty unique for this product.
And this is so important right now because I think as more people realize the climate crisis is here, and it's not far off in the distance, it's in the future, and also just geographically, it's everywhere. It's coming for all of us. People are alarmed. And so I would imagine more people are asking about these issues, those who have funds to invest. So tell us, all the things that people should know, and even for people like myself who are not very financially savvy.
Well, I think it's becoming top of mind for people, even the average person who doesn't have too much money to invest. So, even if you don't proactively invest on your own, you should still be trying to contribute to your company 401k plan because it's tax protected, and it's the best way to save for retirement. And while there are these expensive green investment options for more wealthy individuals and institutions, there haven't been good options for average people who just invest via their 401ks. So that's why we've made this first product that targets 401ks in particular. And if you want to be able to invest, you can do that by emailing your HR and asking them to add a fossil-free investment option to your 401k lineup. Let them know why it's important to you and why you care about climate change. And then they can look at the options available and then add an option to the lineup.
That leads to a couple more questions, but before I forget, we just withdrew our savings and checking accounts from Wells Fargo because they're not one of the good banks in terms of investments in fossil fuels. I wanted to, when I did it, let the bank know why I was doing it. What's the most efficient way to do that? I was going to research that, and maybe you can save me a step, and others who might want to be doing the same thing. And something I've talked about with my husband for years, and we just, between us had enough accounts that seemed complicated, but finally it was time. So I imagine there's others out there who are doing the same.
And I would, it's great that you did that. And it is a growing movement to move to more green banks. Our board member, Marilyn Waite, has a great resource on her own website, marilynwaite.com, where she lists all the green banks that are out there. So if anyone's looking to do this, I recommend that list. And how do you let the bank know why you're moving your money? I think the fact that you moved your money at all is the first thing. They should start noticing this trend of they're losing customers and they need to change something if they want to retain customers. And then honestly, I think just submitting something through the whatever customer communication portal you have is the best way to do it. And specifically ask them to ask the customer service representative to pass on the information to the investment committee so that the bank, that the people who are making investment decisions at the bank realize that their investment decisions are having an impact on their customers leaving.
Absolutely. Get more bang for your buck removal in this case. Let them know about it so they don't have to guess. And the more people who do make a fuss about it, and there will be more, the more they better rethink it. Like they may not realize that people care about this or pay attention. And it's really only the last 5 years or so that, I've seen reports showing that it's, up there with a couple of the other big banks that are just not doing our planet and climate any good. So great. What if you don't have a 401k? If you don't work for a company, I'm an independent, journalist. And I imagine there's others out there. Are there other options or offerings from Sphere that can help move money in the right direction?
Yes, actually, the first product that we've launched, which is targeted at 401ks, anyone can invest in it. All it is a mutual fund. And so you can just go to our website and see how to invest, and you don't have to be at a company to be able to do so. So if you have your own IRA for retirement purposes or just investment money on the side with no specific type of vehicle, all of that can be invested in the mutual fund directly. And if you have money that you're trying to invest in a well-diversified way that's invested across different industries, but you don't want to be funding fossil fuel companies, then this would be a good option for you.
Does Sphere actually provide the service of investing? Let's say I had $10,000 and I said, Alex, make this money do as much good as it can, environmentally, social justice, the things I care about and so many people, more and more people do today.
So you're asking whether we
would you be the entity, Sphere, your company? If could I go to you and say, where shall I invest this money?
Like the Wells Fargo advisors, et cetera, is what you're asking.
Yeah, exactly. Do you serve as an advisor for specific, companies to invest in? I know you talk about the ones not to, but do you actually give that advice as part of what Sphere does?
Sphere is not a financial advisor in that way, but we can point you to financial advisors who can help you invest along with your values. So we're making these publicly available funds that anyone can invest in, even if they don't have a personal financial advisor. But it can be a very good idea to go through a financial advisor. And there are a lot of really great green ones out there. And if you email us at hello@oursphere.org, we're happy to help point you towards a few great values-aligned specialists in financial advising.
And of course, big news, certainly in your world, last week, the SEC announced that it was going to, I guess, begin the process of requiring companies to divulge what their carbon footprint is. Tell us how that came about, how likely that is to become, in fact, enforced, and what that means.
Yes, so there's been a growing concern in the SEC and more broadly in the investment community about something called greenwashing. Now, greenwashing is where one way to define it would be that a company spends more money on marketing how green it is than it does on the actual greening of its operations.
You're talking about like the fossil fuel companies do. So well.
Like the fossil fuel companies do. They spend far more money on their green advertising, algae commercials, et cetera, than they actually do on the algae technology itself. There has been such a huge increase in interest in values-aligned investing and climate-friendly investing, and there has been no standard way for companies to report on how they're doing when it comes to the climate. And so the SEC has decided to step in and start providing a framework for how companies should report on that. And what happened last week was they put out the proposed guidelines that I think will very likely go into effect. And what those proposed guidelines do is they fall into two categories. One is they give a framework for how companies should report on the risk to their operations posed by climate change. So, if there's a flood, how does that impact their operations? The second thing that it does is requires them to report on their carbon equivalent emissions, so on their greenhouse gas emissions. And what's really exciting about that is it's the first time that companies, all public companies, will be required to report on their climate impact, and they'll be required to do it in a standard way. So for the first time, investors will be able to make informed decisions on how to invest our money. If we're trying to have a lower carbon impact or climate impact with our money, now we actually have much better visibility in how to do that. And then the same goes for financial companies that are making products, mutual funds, index funds, ETFs that are climate impact products. They'll have a much better ability to be sure that what they're advertising as a climate-friendly investment product actually is climate-friendly.
One of the wonderful articles linked on your website, it was a Bloomberg article recently in the last couple of weeks talking about what ESG doesn't do. And I learned a lot in I guess, most dramatically, that it measures just as much or maybe more so what impact the world is going to have on that company's bottom line as it does the impact of that company's environmental footprint, carbon and otherwise, on the world. It's sort of like, what? And I didn't know that. I suspect most people don't. Is ESG really greenwashing? And does that need to be looked at more closely? And will the SEC action address all that, or is more action needed to really get information out there so people are not thinking they're doing something good when in fact they're doing something good for the company's bottom line, but not for the atmosphere.
No, I think it comes down to, I don't think anyone is trying to do anything nefarious when it comes to ESG. I think, the managers who are managing ESG portfolios are really trying to do their best job in creating an ESG product. But let's back up and let's actually define what ESG is, because I think when it comes down to it, this is miscommunication, where the financial industry is using a term, ESG, that the average person who cares about climate change has never even heard of and doesn't know what it means, right? So, my experience looking for climate-friendly investment options at IR Labs, my first company, was I would say, hey, we'd like a climate-friendly investment option. And then the advisors I'd talk to would say, okay, let me look into ESG options for you. And I'd be like, what's ESG? How does that relate to climate? So it turns out ESG stands for environment, social, and governance focused funds. There's no definition for what that means. So financial managers all decide on their own how to define that, and they all have different ways of defining it. But one of the most prevalent ways, and the one that this Bloomberg article you mentioned dives into, is they'll look into making sure that investments that the companies invested in are not going to be overly impacted by climate risk, for example, or social risk, or these other things. So it's not so much about what impact do these companies have on the planet and humanity, and more about what impact does the planet and humanity have on the company's bottom line.
Who knew?
And it's something that's widely known and obvious within the financial professionals community, but something that is just a shock and most people don't realize when they're not in the finance industry and just looking for a way to invest in a green way. And something that's really interesting to me is that the SEC did not use the term ESG in this proposed rule. Instead, it specifically was a rule about climate, not about ESG. And I think that will go a huge way towards starting to align the way the finance industry talks about values aligned investing with what the community, what people want to have as their options for values aligned investing.
I think the first sign for me that ESG might not be all it's cracked up to be was when, is it Tariq Fancy? Is that how you pronounce his name? Who said he created the thing, ESG, when he was with BlackRock, and that it's not the answer at all. Again, I didn't pay too close attention to it because didn't have money to invest, but now more interested. And I wonder what you think of his doubts about, what he created. And has there been any reform? That article, he wrote a column or something, I think a year or two ago, and that got a lot of attention, as it should. Like, this is something I created and it doesn't do what it says it does. That was pretty alarming for anyone paying attention. Is that what kind of impact does that have, his confession, if you will?
Yeah, so Tariq Fancy ran the sustainability group at BlackRock, and they've launched a lot of ESG focused options for customers. And he ended up resigning because he felt that he was actually hurting the environment more than helping by running these ESG strategies at BlackRock, and made big waves by kind of announcing that after he resigned. His message is that even labeling anything as green or ESG does more harm than good. And I think that can be very true, and is true for a lot of the things that are labeled as ESG. But I do think there are ways to invest that do make an impact. And there are a few good examples. A new ETF run by a company called Engine Number One that what they have done is they've created ways to be active shareholders where they vote their shares to try to create change in the companies that they invest in. And they targeted Exxon Mobil to start, and they managed to replace 3 of the board members at Exxon with new board members who care about climate change. And this was really pretty unprecedented in terms of the impact that shareholder activism can have. The strategy that we take at Sphere is one of divestment. So we're just not investing in fossil fuel companies rather than being active shareholders, though we are active shareholders in the remainder of the companies that we do invest in. So for example, the financial companies like banks that we do invest in, we're active shareholders, voting for them to do things like stop financing fossil fuel projects. But the divestment approach also has a history of having been successful. And I think the most notable time in history when divestment was successful was when apartheid was a big issue in South Africa. And there was a huge divestment movement to stop investing in companies that are supporting the apartheid system. And it made a huge difference. It was part of what brought that down. And so there are ways for our dollars to really speak volumes, whether it's through active shareholder votes or through sending a message by removing our dollars from institutions. And so, while Tariq Fancy, I think, was a little bit was very frustrated by the system that he was in, I don't think it means it's impossible for us to make a difference with our money.
And since he divulged that, have there been changes or not yet? I mean, I don't know how that impacted your company. Were you already in operation at that time? And did you learn a lot from it? Were you surprised, or were you like, oh, thank goodness the truth is finally getting out there? Not to put you on the spot, but I'm just wondering, people like yourself who are so financially savvy and green savvy at the same time. Was it surprising?
I wasn't surprised at all. My founding partner, this person, Jason Britton, who actually manages this mutual fund, he's our chief investment officer for this first product. He has a similar background where he worked at a big financial institution running their sustainability strategies, and he retired because he was frustrated to be doing what he called the greenwashing dirty work of a company that was still investing in non-green things outside of his own group. So I think it's actually a feeling that a lot of people in the industry have. And I think it speaks volumes that he decided to work on this strategy instead. So, he doesn't think that there's no use in trying to do green investing at all. He just wanted to change the type of green investing he did and work with an entity that wasn't, doing green things on one side while still funding the dirty stuff on the other side.
By the way, you mentioned the divestment movement in South Africa. It's also taken hold here. Bill McKibben has been a big proponent of it in 350.org, and universities like Harvard, have said they're not pulling it all out, but they're not going to continue to invest in companies that are involved with fossil fuels. I don't know if you want to get into the scope 1, 2, and 3 distinctions in terms of climate impact. It's something I learned in one of the articles on your website. Like there's the direct, like the fossil fuel companies that make, fossil fuels. And then there's those that have kind of an indirect impact and then less so. Because I think it's a good time to educate people if it's not too complicated. Don't want to get too far into the weeds, but maybe just a quick overview of those different levels, because they're, looking downstream, there are impacts. This is why it's been so difficult to come up with an app or some company that can tell you that whatever you eat, drive, buy, whatever product, what's the carbon, impact from that, because there's so many factors, intervening variables.
Yes. Okay, so let's break this down. To start, there's climate friendly investing, and then there's fossil free investing, which is climate friendly, but it's more specific. So our first product we launched, the Sphere 500 Fossil Free Index, is not even paying attention to carbon footprint, scope 1, 2, or 3. It's not even part of our equation. All that this fund does is it just looks at, is the primary line of business of this company in extracting or distributing or refining fossil fuels? And if so, we're not going to invest in it. There are a few bonuses of having this approach, especially for something like retirement investing or longer term investing. One is that it's a well-diversified approach. So we're not excluding too many companies from our universe. And so you can still be well-diversified across the economy at large. And diversity is good for avoiding risk. If you're too focused in one industry, let's say if you only invest in solar companies, then if the solar industry has something bad happen to it, you could lose your life savings. So that's why diversification is good. And fossil-free investing does not hurt your ability to diversify. But if you want to be a little bit more proactive in the type of climate friendly investing you do, you can also start paying attention to the carbon emissions of the companies you invest in. So that's something that we as a company want to start offering more thoughtful products like that in the future. Our first product is more simple than that. But the way that funds that do those more thoughtful types of products do it, and they're thoughtful, but they also tend to be more expensive as well. So the other benefit of just doing fossil fuel exclusion is we can have a really affordable rate similar to S&P 500 index funds. But when it comes to looking at carbon emissions, it gets complicated, as you said, because there's what's called scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Now, scope 1 is the actual emissions of the buildings where these companies operate, the vehicles that they might own, etc. Scope 2 is the emissions of the power plants that are bringing power to the buildings that they operate, etc. And scope 3 is the emissions of any suppliers that supply goods that go into the products of the company, as well as of any end users who are using those products. So,
Wait, end users meaning the consumer?
Yes, the consumer,
Like
not
what?
all of their carbon emissions, but the emissions that they emit in using the product. So for a company like Google, the scope 1 makes a lot of, it's pretty obvious, right? You have data centers, those have certain amounts of emissions. Some of the emissions come from scope 2, which is the power plants that they don't own, but that are burning fuels to provide power to their power plants. Scope 3, their users don't use too much, don't emit too much carbon in using their products, but their suppliers probably do emit a good amount of carbon. So scope 3 is mostly about suppliers for that type of company. On the other hand, if you look at a fossil fuel company, scope 3 emissions includes all carbon emitted by anybody who drives a car that's burning their gasoline. So if they don't include scope 3, then you're really missing the vast majority of the climate impact that fossil fuel companies have. And in the past, they have conveniently excluded scope 3 emissions when reporting on their carbon impacts because there have been no standard rules about how to report on carbon emissions. So something that's really exciting about this proposed regulation from the SEC is that they will be requiring some reporting of scope 3 emissions. So there will now be a standard, and now fossil fuel companies won't be able to report that they have lower emissions than non-fossil fuel companies, because there's no way getting around that the vast majority of emissions that exist, the reason climate change exists is because we are taking fossil fuels from under the Earth's crust and burning them and putting all that CO2 in the air, in the atmosphere. If we were not burning fossil fuels, we wouldn't be in this predicament of having climate change.
And to just ask you a question that reveals how complicated this process really is. So my husband and I have electric cars after driving hybrids for many years. And if we're getting most of our energy from renewable resources, we do have solar power, then that would be less of an impact. But as long as wherever you get your power is predominantly fossil fuel energy, which I believe is still the case in this country, that most are predominantly fossil fuel, not renewable, then does that change the equation?
Don't hesitate to buy an electric car, or don't feel bad about driving your electric car because of the fuel source on your grid. It's great that you installed solar, but in general, the equation is changing on the electric grid, where solar, wind, and batteries are actually less expensive to install than most fossil fuel types of new generation. So the grid is becoming more green at an amazingly fast pace. And so buy an electric car now would be my advice, even if you're not sure how green your grid is, because even if it isn't there yet, it will be getting there soon, just because there's an amazing lowering in prices.
This explosion of EVs, with high gas prices, Americans want to suddenly find out about electric cars. And, it's blown my mind that all these years I've been covering the green beat, like only 2% of all vehicles in this country were electric. I hope it's up at least somewhat from there. But with this new interest, and now we have the, supply chain problem. So it's taking longer to get them, and the price is going up. That may offset some of this enthusiasm. Is that going to, can the grid handle, let's just say we went from 2% to 20% in the next 5 years of electric vehicles. Is that a good thing? And will that help push, energy providers to be more green, or only if consumers make a big deal about it?
Yes, if consumers are making a big deal out of it, we'll force our utilities and our governments to put the money and the investment towards upgrading the grid, because the grid, as it stands right now, it cannot handle it. But utilities know that this wave of demand is coming, and they're working on installing the improvements so the grid can handle it. And honestly, regulation, new laws are really important in enabling this. The federal government has been negotiating these green provisions and has not been able to get them passed yet, but there's a huge amount of money earmarked for these types of infrastructure updates and grid improvements that'll enable the electric car revolution. And something you can do to help, besides buying an electric car and showing that the demand is there, is also getting in touch with your legislators, get in touch with your senator and your representatives, and let them know that you want them to vote for green policies so that money can get allocated where it should.
That was my next question. I could talk to you all day, but we do have to wrap up in a couple minutes. And that is, what would you advise our viewers to do, even if they don't have money to invest right now? One is what you just said. What other tips do you have? Because we like to think that, talking is just the first step. It needs to lead to action. But if we don't understand all these complex issues, whether it's energy or economics, we're not going to take the right actions.
Yeah, so what you can do is, if you work at a big company that does offer a 401k, email your HR manager and ask for a fossil-free investment option today. It takes 5 minutes. We have an example email on our website. If you don't work at a big company, but you know people who do, let them know about this option. They'd probably be really interested in leading a movement within their own company, because most people are worried about climate change these days. And this gives people a tangible way they can have a big impact by kind of leading this movement within their own organization. Mm-hmm. And then you can also invest directly in climate-friendly strategies and mutual funds like this one, if you have the money to invest. And then everybody can write emails to their representatives and tell them to pass climate legislation urgently, because we need it now.
One of the things you mentioned that I wanted to go back to, but we'll just have to kind of summarize, are there national green banks? I know years ago in San Francisco, the first green bank that I was aware of, I think Resource something, and then Aspiration does a lot of advertising that they, are a good, green, socially responsible company. Is that accurate? And how can we know if we do want to look for, eco-friendly or forward bank?
Yeah, so there are a few. For example, the bank that we as a company use, that's an older one that's been doing this for a while, is called Beneficial State Bank. They don't invest in fossil fuels. And what that means is they don't use your savings you've deposited with them to then go and finance fossil fuel projects, which is very important. And they actually proactively go and finance renewable energy projects with the savings that you have deposited. So Beneficial State Bank is a great one. There are a couple of newer banks, kind of neobanks, I think is the term, that are pretty cool, because they make for a really nice user experience if you like having an online or app-based banking experience. Atmos is one of them, and Ando is another. So there are a lot of great options for being able to make sure that when you have savings deposited, they're actually going towards funding solar projects and wind projects, et cetera.
Are the banks you mentioned local, regional, statewide, national, or does it even matter at this point?
I believe all three of those are national, so it doesn't matter where you are.
Okay, that's good to know. And Aspiration, do you know about their green cred?
Actually, Beneficial State Bank is not national. It's West Coast based. I believe Atmos and Ando are national. And then what were you saying about Aspiration?
I'm just asking if I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have any, intel on, is Aspiration aspirational in their green goals, or are they actually doing it?
I'm not positive about how they invest their money. So if you deposit savings with them, I'm not sure where those savings go. I believe that their green claim is that they plant trees on your behalf. Which
is in itself controversial, but it seems to be a good thing. And it is if they're planted in the right place and in the right way and kept up and all that. But that's for another day, another conversation. Alex, Wright Gladstein, I'm very glad that we got to speak with you. I've learned a lot, and I know there's so much more to delve into, but that's why it's so beneficial to do these interviews, because you kind of give us the most important scoop, curate the information that consumers really need to know if they do want to invest in a healthier future for their children, grandchildren, and don't want to be perpetuating the problems, especially all these people who work so hard for environmental causes. And then to learn, like myself, that, wow, all these years I've been like negating all my hard work and then some. So
yeah, that's how I felt too. So yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And it's been such a fun conversation.
truly my pleasure. And as I say, one of my many slogans, the future is green or not at all. And that's why those of us who know that we've got to go to electric cars and renewable energy sources, all the things that have to change, we've got that inside edge, right? Because we know what's coming, whether or not, it has to come. It just has to. So, Tesla, those kind of companies are good bets, I'm sure. So thanks so much. And sphere.com is your website?
Actually, it's oursphere.org. So
Oursphere.org. Glad I asked. Well, we'd love to have you back again, because I do have a whole other list of questions, but that was a really good start. Thanks so much. And thanks so much for watching Green TV. Want to invite you to go to our YouTube channel, Green TV on YouTube, and subscribe. The more subscribers we get, the sooner we can start doing live streaming. We want to thank Christine Weiss, who takes these interviews and does a little bit of editing, not too much needed, I hope. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.